I'm going to beg for a little bit of forgiveness up ahead. If you have to remember, like most of us old timers, we started out with slide trays, and the new technology is sometimes a little confusing. But anyway, we'll make the most of it, folks. So let's get rocking and rolling here. Today, I'm going to talk to you about weed management and improved pastures and hay meadows. One thing that we always have to keep in mind, of course, in today's climate is talking about integrated weed management as part of integrated pest management. I think that, a lot of the things that fall into this category here are things we've been doing, in the past, where we're combining mowing practices in some cases along with grazing management, as well as fertilization and the use of herbicides in our improved pastures. And again, this is all in an integrated approach to keeping the weeds out of the fields. As we look at trying to decide when to pull the plug and the timing of applications and what have you, sometimes it can get a little hairy in determining whether or not you're going to have enough return on your investment. Your investment, of course, being whether you're going to go out there and shred or whether you're going to treat with herbicides. So I will tell you right now, with 5,000 different broadleaf weeds and 1,800 different grass weeds in the state of Texas, we don't have many economic thresholds established for individual weeds. That'd take that'd be quite an undertaking. But anyway, obviously you have to make any practice pay for yourself. Sometimes people use a rule of thumb that when weeds are more than 20% of the pasture, you should go ahead and spray. But again, even this gets a little cumbersome in really making a good solid weed management decision. And a lot of this has to do because it depends on a number of things. First of all, it depends on whether or not you have an annual or a perennial weed in there. It also depends, of course, whether or not you're talking about the architecture of a certain weed. When we talk about the architecture of a weed, essentially what we're saying here is that if you have a weed that grows up and umbles out or forms an umbrella type of canopy where it intercepts sunlight that should be getting to your grass, then that's going to impose a burden on the grass trying to grow underneath, because like moisture and nutrients, any type of forage grass also is going to have photosynthetic light getting to it for a certain period of the day. So the architecture of the weed, of course, also has something to do with it. So if you've got a stand of broomweed that's really heavy out there, or a stand of goatweed or doveweed, things like that, then this can be a real issue for you. And of course, whether or not the plant is poisonous or not. Poisonous not only from a direct consumption standpoint, but also if you get too much of it wrapped up in your hay bale or whatever, it can still have some of these poisonous characteristics after that. Does weed management pay? The old rule of thumb that we often use is one that was established years ago, where we can assume that in native grass pastures, you can expect a pound of grass for every pound of weeds controlled. In Bermuda grass pastures or other improved forages, you can expect 2 to 5 pounds. So again, it's really tough to nail this in terms of an economic threshold, but if you wanted to go out and collect weeds off a certain portion of an acre and then decide, weigh the weeds and then decide, whether or not to pull the plug, I guess you could do that if you wanted to establish an economic threshold. But anyway, with that said, weeds occur in a pasture or hay meadow simply because they're allowed to. And what we're talking about here, when the grass is not dense enough to outcompete the weeds and also provide for the weeds to get up through the grass canopy and what have you, then we're going to have issues. And I'll say this again at the end of my program: the best weed control measure that you can have out in the pasture is a good heavy stand of grass. Sometimes we can manage that, sometimes we can't. Relative to identifying weeds, it's really a kind of it doesn't get real complicated in terms of identifying weeds to the point where you can get or where you can ascertain a control measure. Some basic decisions you have to make is whether or not you have a broadleaf or grass out there, or whether you have other plants such as sedges, brush species, or vines. If you can identify whether the plant is an annual or a perennial, whether it's a broadleaf or a grass, then that goes a long way in terms of which control measures are going to be effective for you. When we get into sedges, again, these are separated from both grasses and broadleaf weeds. They are different. So if you ever hear anybody call nut sedge nut grass, it's a misnomer. So keep that in mind. And then, of course, you're all familiar with brush and then herbaceous and woody vines as well. Relative to annual broadleaf weed control, really no big deal. We have had for a number of years all kinds of different products, to control these broadleaf weeds. And the key point I would suggest here is that we just get the job done early in terms of getting them out of there and eliminating the competition. And I'll give some specific example of that here in just a little bit. Annual broadleaf weeds, for the most part, these are going to be much easier to control than perennial weeds. And it all has to do with, well, a lot of it has to do with the root system. If you look at the root system of any annual weed and compare it to a perennial weed, which I'll show you here in a little bit, it's a relatively limited root system. An annual plant only needs to produce enough of a root system to get it through the season. So if it's coming up in the spring, growing through the summer, and setting seed in the fall, then of course it only needs so much of a root system, because it doesn't have to worry about building and storing reserves that are going to be used to help it come out the following year. So again, I think we just need to keep that in mind when controlling our annual weeds. And again, as you might see, I'm sorry for that little interruption there. As you might know, what the case would be, where you have smaller weeds, they're going to have less of a root system, and again, less able to handle any adversities such as shredding or herbicide treatments or what have you. So with that said, some examples of annual broadleaf weeds would be things like bitter sneezeweed, for example, prickly poppy, annual broomweed, marsh elder. Some of you folks may call this sumpweed or sulfa weed. Comes up heavily in river bottoms. Of course, the king of annuals all over the place is woolly croton, which you probably don't know it as woolly croton. You probably know it as either doveweed or goatweed. And then groundsel, if you're up in East Texas, for example, this might be a big problem for you. One thing I will tell you that, and I'll make a point of this, when weeds get into the flowering stage like this here, you're wasting your money if you're to come in there in terms of employing a control measure. By this time, the plants have flowered, set seed, and they've picked your pocket all year long. So it does you no good to treat at this particular time if you're interested in getting a forage response from that removal, because by this time here, or this time here even, it's too late to get your money back, so to speak. With that said, what herbicides will control annual broadleaf weeds? There are a number of products out there. Some of the more common products, of course, include 2,4-D, which has been around since after World War II, very widely used, and you can buy a lot of weed control for $1.50 or $2 worth of 2,4-D. There's no question about it. Mixtures such as Weedmaster have not only the 2,4-D in them, but somewhat of a kicker in there with the herbicide dicamba, with a smaller portion of dicamba than the 2,4-D in there. The Grazon P plus D is essentially another step up in terms of weed control power, so to speak, where Picloram has been added to the 2,4-D. And these products have all been around, long enough to where you probably are pretty familiar with the use of them, probably have even used them, and what have you. Some of the newer products, like Milestone. Milestone is a whole new molecule of a active ingredient called aminopyrrolid. It was introduced by Dow 4 or 5 years ago. Then Dow formulated some additional products with aminopyrrolid included in them, such as Chaparral, which has aminopyrrolid and metsulfuron. The metsulfuron you might be familiar with because it's also the active ingredient in the product Ally or Cimarron that we often use for Vaseygrass control. Grazon Next HL is again another aminopyrrolid product in combination with 2,4-D in an 8% aminopyrrolid, 41% 2,4-D mixture. It's gotten more complicated with the addition of Pastora HL. That is, again, aminopyrrolid plus 2,4-D, only in smaller concentrations relative to the aminopyrrolid in there. So it's got less aminopyrrolid in there and more 2,4-D compared to the Grazon Next HL. So again, with that said, let's keep rocking and rolling here. The Cimarron Plus is a Bayer product. It used to be DuPont, now it's Bayer's, where they have included in them metsulfuron plus chlorsulfuron. Both the metsulfuron, again, is the old Ally Cimarron, and then they've added a small portion of chlorsulfuron, which is an old, well-established wheat herbicide, but again, can be used in pastures, essentially for additional knockdown as well as some additional residual weed control as well. Cimarron Max is, again, the metsulfuron plus 2,4-D and dicamba. This combination here offers a lot in terms of both knockdown of not only annuals but perennial weeds, especially the nightshades and things like that. So it's a very good product in terms of putting the right components together to get some excellent weed control from it. A new entry into the forage market here is a product called Sharpen, and Sharpen was and still is a corn and sorghum herbicide. The active ingredient is saflufenicel in that. We've only looked at this 1 year. I can show you some test plots of that. You can see the untreated control, and this was primarily a marsh elder study. You can see a heavy population of marsh elder at this site, and if you look at the picture on the right, that is Sharpen at 1 ounce per acre, and pretty well totally eliminated it. So this is a product that you can be applied at very low use rates. It's going to obviously have to be applied very accurately with those low use rates, but it's highly effective on marsh elder, which is a pretty difficult annual weed to control, especially if you let it get out of hand. Now, we treated this stuff when it was about 8 inches tall, not at the stage that you're looking at the untreated on the left. So just keep in mind, treatment timeliness is also going to be an issue here. I often get the question asked, should I spray or shred my weeds? Well, there's a couple things you have to think about, and one of those is indicated, here on this slide. When you're looking at the economic return and the total cost per acre, and these costs are probably pretty stale by now, but I think the general point remains. If you're looking at operating a tractor with a 6-foot shredder on it, your cost per acre is going to be this, compared to a 40 horsepower tractor with a 30-foot boom sprayer, very commonly used, is going to be this. So again, the shredding operation is going to cost more than if you were using a herbicide application out there. So again, that difference is probably, this 274 per acre difference is probably even much higher than that now, considering capital equipment cost and all that other stuff. So I think we have to we have to be very judgmental in terms of deciding whether or not we need to use a shredder in there or go in with a herbicide application. Now, with that said, I'm not telling you that shredding is a waste of time, because it does provide some benefit in terms of weed removal. There's no question about that, and it also may be the method of choice if your pasture hay meadow that you're treating is up next to a subdivision or close to town or what have you, or close to a sensitive crop area where you can't afford to have any drift from a herbicide onto a sensitive crop or landscape plant nearby. So, there are some reasons that you should shred, but again, I think we need to understand the costs involved with that. Probably a better illustration of what shredding and application timeliness is this here, and this is a study that David Beatty, our forage specialist, and I did many years ago. If you look at the date down there in the lower left-hand corner, it's 1990-91. David and I were both still pups at the time, but anyway, with that said, let's talk about the results from this. Without getting too complicated, I'll try to help you out a little bit in terms of what we're looking at here. What we're essentially, we're looking at herbicide applications that were made early in the year, and by early we're talking about weeds that were small, versus later applications made when the weeds were larger and corresponding to a time when you would normally go in there and shred, versus no weed control with fertilizer only, or no treatment or fertilizer at all. So essentially what we're looking at here is the forage response in terms of dry matter and pounds per acre when the weeds were treated when they were 4 to 6 inches tall, and whether they were followed up with fertilization or not. So you can see the forage response in here when we treated the weeds when they were small. Now, as the weeds got larger and we treated them when they were 12 to 14 inches and employed shredding at the same time, you can see our forage production for the year drop off dramatically. And another point I guess I will make here, where we looked at no weed control treatment at all, neither shredding or chemical, but we fertilized, you can see a little bump here in production compared to where we didn't do anything. But again, what this tells you here is you can't fertilize your way out of a weed problem. Now, good with the flip side of that is fertilization will help you from having a weed problem because you're growing a more competitive forage grass. But if you already have a weed problem with grass in there, you're not going to fertilize your way out of that weed problem. So let's get that settled right now. With that said, I'll talk just briefly about this here. This was an extremely wet year for us in the study. We've only had one additional year like that since 1991, so we have to keep this data in mind here. You can see our forage production was tremendous in here, and our treatment timing didn't seem to make a whole lot of difference. And this is simply because if there's enough moisture to go around for both the weeds and the grass, they're both going to produce. And again, we don't see a whole lot of difference in the shredding in here, but again, 9 times out of 10, this is the situation you're going to have out there. So again, get the weeds out early when they're small. Moving on. Again, the very simple point to remember, if you don't remember anything else, the minute weeds come up while your forage grass is growing, they're picking your pocket for moisture and nutrients. I mean, it doesn't get any simpler than that, folks. And this is moisture you wish you had in July or August. If you're ever sitting there complaining about, in the middle of July, complaining about not having enough rainfall and this or that, well, that inch of rain that you wish you had in July or August may have been what was taken up by those weeds competing early on in the season that you didn't get in there and control. So I don't mean to rub your nose in it, but that's, essentially the tail there. So now you may come back at me with a question. So what if the weeds don't all come up at the same time? No question about it. When the soil temperature and moisture are right, most of what will emerge will do so. So, weeds have a biological trigger. When soil temperatures get to a certain degree, and usually that's about 55 to 65 degrees for most of our annual weeds. When that soil temperature at 4 inches deep is 55 to 65 degrees, and they have enough moisture to imbibe and germinate, they're going to do that. All right? And, with that said, certainly these conditions will vary between weed species, but not too much. So, getting back to our question about, so what if the weeds don't come up all at the same time, I would just tell you that, get in there and try to treat when most weeds are still in the treatment size limitations listed on the label. So if, for example, you've got some weeds that are coming up that are 4 or 6 inches tall, it's probably time to start considering to pull the plug. And hopefully by that time you'll have additional infestations of additional weeds that are also, emerged at that time, which is probably going to be the case. But don't let the ones that are already up and growing, get out of hand. Otherwise, you're going to have to go in there with a heavier dose of herbicide, which is going to be more costly and what have you. So keep that in mind. Now, let's talk a little bit about perennial broadleaf weeds. Perennial weeds in general, and even though we're talking about Johnsongrass and a sedge here, perennial weeds in general are going to have a very well-developed secondary root system, which is its primary function is going to be to store enough carbohydrates and goodies down there, so to speak, to help that weed come back the following year, whether it's it's in the form of rhizomes or tubers and rhizomes in the case of the sedges or other broadleaf weeds. So again, our objective here is going to be a little bit different than it was with annual weeds, where we're not only going to have to get the top growth knocked back, but we're also going to have some effect on the root growth. Because again, if this is what's helping that weed come back year after year after year, then this is what we've got to act on. So, keep that in mind as we continue to talk about this here. Now, an example of another perennial weed would be Silverleaf Nightshade, and what I've shown here is an example of a rhizome that is again. This is where a lot of the storage occurs for this weed to come back year to year, but it may also look like you have a couple or 3 or 4, in the case of western ragweed, for example, you may have a half a dozen plants all connected to the same root system here. Now, the point I want to make for this is twofold. First of all, what you see on top, below the soil surface, what you see on top as being 2 separate plants, or however many, may be all the same plant connected by the rhizome system. And the other point that I want to make here is that if you go in there with tillage and start cutting up this rhizome in here, more than likely that rhizome is going to have a bud at each one of these sections in here, so you're going to exacerbate your problem with tillage. This is a particular issue. For example, if you're going in and want to establish a new forage grass, if you're going from, say, Tifton or Jigs or Common Bermuda or Coastal even to Tifton 85, and let's say you've got some Johnsongrass in there, and in your soil preparation phase, you're cutting up a lot of the rhizomes in there, so again, what happens is you end up with worse of a mess than you had when you started. And this newly sprigging, all this the procedures and what have you, I'll talk about here later. But keep in mind, tillage relative to a control measure for perennial weeds such as Silverleaf Nightshade and others is not the way to go, even if you're thinking about that. So, examples of our perennial broadleaf weeds, of course, are going to be some that you recognize. The western ragweed I talked about earlier. This is one where, again, you may have half a dozen, what looks like a half a dozen separate plants up there, but they're all connected by the same root system. False indigo or wild indigo is one that comes up, and this is a plant that's a little bit tricky for us in terms of its appearance, because if it gets real hot and dry during the summer, this guy will turn almost a charcoal gray color, and you'll think it's dead, but essentially, its inner mechanisms have told us that, look, dude, you're going to die here if you keep growing aggressively. So it shuts itself down, and then the leaves turn gray, but that root system underneath is still very much alive under there. So the point there is, if you're going to treat this thing, treat it while it's still green out there. Silverleaf Nightshade, that's the example I presented earlier that had the rhizomes that were connected to two different plants in there. Carolina horse nettle, this is kind of like for lack of a better term, this is a Silverleaf Nightshade on steroids. Larger seeded fruit, more robust root system, just all the way down the line. Texas thistle is one that we see in a lot on the roadsides. It probably doesn't warrant aggressively going after with any kind of weed control measure, because it's one that flourishes during the cool season or the winter, and then comes out and it becomes real competitive later on in the winter and early spring. But by the time our summer perennial forages get kicking in, this thing's going downhill, so it's not going to be real competitive from that standpoint. Buttercup, big, again, much the same story. We'll have a lot of that in the springtime. It'll start to go down fairly quick. Common milkweed and we've got a lot of different milkweeds. You pull off a leaf here, and they'll ooze a latex white latex type of sap from there. But the tough thing about our milkweeds is they have a taproot that'll go down forever to collect whatever moisture it needs to at whatever point of growth. So again, it's not only important, and the other thing that's difficult about milkweeds is they have a very thick cuticle layer on them. So you got to use a good surfactant to get the herbicide to stick on those leaves, and also give it time to penetrate into the plant and then travel down into the root system there. Texas bull nettle, this is the granddaddy of herbaceous weeds. There's a simple fact that you do not want to sit on this bare-butted. Other than that, it's got an extremely well-developed root system underneath. This is one that that's prickly and nasty on the top, but the real problem is what's underneath there. This root system on this guy can go down 20 feet and be as big around as 20 inches in diameter if it's been out there for years and years and years. So this is probably not one you're going to get with a broadcast spray of anything. Spot sprays and what have you are going to be, the deal there. Moving on a little bit, let's talk about practices and products and what have you. Again, we've essentially got the whole slew of products that we talked about for annual weeds. in there, from 2,4-D on up to the sharpen and what have you. The deal here is that all of these are going to have to be applied at higher application rates on the upper end of the rate range if you want to have any degree of effectiveness at all in there. In addition, there are some more heavy hitters in terms of weed control, being Surmount, Pasture Guard HL, and Remedy Ultra. Most of the time we think of these as brush or vine herbicides, but again, a little bit of these, especially if you use them in spot sprays at various solutions, percentages where you put an ounce or two or whatever in a gallon of water along with the surfactant, and then pretty much spray or squirt on the individual plants there. This is also another effective and sometimes very economical. With spot sprays, you can spray a lot of weeds in a short period of time, but in other situations, especially in the case of annual weeds, you're probably not going to have you're probably going to be better off with a broadcast spray application with annual weeds. But in the case of perennials, many times their density is not enough to justify a broadcast application. So spot sprays work very well from that standpoint. Let's talk a little bit here about timing. Again, I've used my friend Texas bull nettle here in terms of treating perennial weeds. And in the next few minutes, you're going to hear me talk essentially out of the other side of my mouth here, because I'm going to talk about a little bit different in terms of timing on treating perennial weeds. The time to treat perennial weeds, for maximum effectiveness is going to be when you have the greatest amount of leaf and stem growth on top. All right? So you've gotten to the point here where the plant is flowering and producing fruit, and at that point there, you know that the leaves of the plant have stopped expanding. They're still green and growing, but again, the leaves are expanding or have stopped expanding here, but they're still grabbing photosynthetic light, so they're still undergoing photosynthesis. The question becomes then, well, what are they doing with the food they're producing? Well, they finished, shipping stuff or groceries, so to speak, to the fruit, and now they're at the point where they're starting this, what we call a reversal of the carbohydrate flow, which is sending a lot of the goodies that are to be made to the leaves in the leaves down into the root system of the plant. And again, this is the key to getting effective control, is getting enough herbicide, the maximum amount of herbicide intercepted by this top growth here at a point to where you have the reversal of this carbohydrate flow, and it sends it with the carbohydrates down into the root system to help you relative to getting some effectiveness on the root as well as the top growth in the plant. So again, it kind of flies in the face of what I told you earlier about annual broadleaf weed control, where you get on them and get them out of there and what have you. I'm going to address a couple questions I see that have popped up here. Ted is asking, what is the rule when rain is in the forecast with regards to spraying? That's a good question, Ted. Most of our products, are going to, if you look at the label, they're not going to give you a rule of thumb relative to, you have to either spray 4 hours before a heavy rain or what have you. I guess if you had to use a general rule of thumb, for most of our pasture herbicides, you need to have them out there probably, 6 to 8 hours before you'd run in danger of them being washed off by rainfall in any amounts to where, it's going to impact control. The most important thing, Ted and others, is, for God's sakes, if you're going to use a foliar applied herbicide, use a surfactant in there, because the surfactant is not only going to help those spray droplets stick to the treated foliage, but it's also going to help them get through the cuticle and down into the plant where they need to be. Kathy, I see you're asking if you wait till they flower, won't all the seeds go and make more plants next year, or are the roots a bigger deal? Kathy, you said it right there. The roots are a bigger deal. Okay, if you first of all, you have to remember that the plant came from somewhere. It either came from seeds or it came from roots. All right. In the case of perennials, seedling plants are not, first of all, not as big a deal because you can kill seedlings just like you could any other annual plant. But the roots are a bigger deal because, again, that root system may have been established years and years before. That root system could be 20 years old, even though it looks like what you got on top is just 1 year's worth of growth. The same thing that my counterparts in range run into with brush species. You don't know how many times that Huisache or McCartney rose or mesquite has been shredded down. You may have a plant that's 4 foot tall, but it may have 20 years worth of root system underneath it, which makes it very difficult to do what we're talking about here. Where we're getting as much on as we can on top, but only a certain portion of that. Or there's only so much that's going to get down into that root system, and if you're talking about a 20-year-old root system, then it's a bad deal. Let's see. So, Kathy, you've also asked, so the thistle roots may have been there, sort of dormant when it rains a lot, and they go crazy. You got it again. Okay. Essentially, the root system is going to remain alive, especially if it's at a depth where it doesn't dry out in the soil. It's going to remain alive, and as soon as that soil temperature warms up to the point where it starts kicking into gear, so to speak, it's going to start grabbing moisture, and then it has to do something to keep growing, so it's going to have to send up green plant material above the soil surface, and then start the process all over again. Rancher Mama, you got a question here. Says, does the herbicide require a license? Most of our herbicides do require a pesticide applicator's license. And ma'am, if I could tell you one thing, for the little effort that it requires to get that license, it's a good learning process, especially with some of this new chemistry that requires a little more thought and diligence. With that, I'm going to move forward here on the slides. And this has also something to do with regulations. The question becomes, can you apply herbicides anytime you want to? Well, it depends on what county you're in. If you're in one of these blue shaded counties in here, there are regulations about which herbicides you can apply during certain times of the year. If you're in an area where there's a lot of crop production along the coast here in the Blacklands or Upper Blacklands, for example, you're going to have to be careful about which products you apply during that time. Now, that doesn't preclude you from getting out there and using a product to control your weeds. So it depends on which product you're talking about. If, for example, we're talking about 2,4-D or 2,4-D containing products such as Rifle D or Weedmaster, Outlaw, products like that, or Grayson P plus D, then these are going to have the regulations associated with them. There are non-regulated alternative herbicides for use in controlling weeds. Cimarron Plus, Milestone, Tordon, Remedy, a lot of these different products here. These prices, again, may be up or down or whatever, but my point is If you are in a regulated county, you can still use a number of herbicides to get the job done. Now, with all that said, even though you can use these alternative herbicides, they will kill susceptible crops or Mrs. McGillicuddy's tomatoes, for example, just like regulated herbicides if you drift spray particles onto them. So again, this kind of leads us into a whole new area here relative to keeping things where you want them to go. So we need to consider in our broadcast spray booms some of the new drift reducing spray tips we have. And again, this is a good idea, especially if you're in an area where you've got cotton in the area, or you've got, again, close to a urban subdivision. This is a must, so to speak. I'll talk just real briefly about a study Joshua McGinney did in his PhD research for me that where he used a fairly expensive piece of equipment that in cooperation with the USDA that looked at individual particle sizes of droplets through laser diffraction. And essentially, to get to the meat and potatoes of this, what we're looking at here, these are the different spray tips from the old XR spray tip to the drift guard to the air induction XR, air induction and turbo T induction. These are some of the newer tips, spray tips that are out there today. And if you look at the blue bars here, what these are is essentially droplet size, individual or average droplet size. So as you go from the XR tips to the TTI tips, you can see that the average droplets get larger in here. Another thing you're going to see as you go from the XR to the TTI tips is you'll see a decrease in driftable fines. This is the red line here, to where in the case of the TTI you have the largest droplets here, and you have the lowest percentage or the lowest amount of driftable fines in there. So, with that said, let me get, and then Cheryl, I'll get to your question here in just a second. With that said, what we're looking at here is when you're looking at these drift reducing tips, as you go from one side, from the left side to the right side, you can see that we're producing larger, heavier droplets with fewer fines. And we've also taken this a step further. Josh took this and has looked at this on a number of weeds and found that even where we have the largest droplets and the fewer fines, that we have no loss in weed control. So this is significant. So essentially there's no excuse for not using a drift reducing tip, especially if you need them. Cheryl's asking if there's such a thing as a drift reducing spray tip for backpack sprayers. Okay, working close to subdivisions and waterways, you'd like to CYA as much as possible. No question about it, Cheryl. For backpack sprayers, there are some tips. And specifically speaking, I can't name any, but there are some tips that are going to create larger droplets. If you want to, the best thing really to eliminate a lot of the drift from backpack sprayers is to take a water bottle, a plastic water bottle, and cut the bottom off of it, or cut it in half, and then put that top portion that has the spout, so to speak, on it, and cover it and put it up over your backpack nozzle tip, so that and then it's kind of hard to visualize. I wish I had a picture of that, but it's kind of hard to visualize. But anyway, you can eliminate a lot of that mist that boils out right at that nozzle orifice area there. How do you treat? Do you treat biennials like perennials? Kathy asks. Pretty much, yes. Wait till they. Well, I say that. Let me back up a little bit. In the case of biennials, it's better to get them sooner in their first year where they're producing a lot of vegetative growth, because that's the time when you can stop them before they bolt up a seed and a flower head. Rancher Mama's asking, how safe are these herbicides on livestock? There are certain re-entry intervals and stuff that are always on the label in terms of look in terms of how safe you can move cattle, or how soon you can move cattle back in there, or how soon you can harvest the hay. Cheryl, kind of like a dog cone, doesn't need to be that large, but that would work if you can figure out a way to attach that thing onto your spot sprayer. Sorry, but I'm going to move on here. Let's talk about Grassbur. If you're a hay grower and a quality hay grower, this is concerned to you. A couple points I'd like to make about Grassbur is that, first of all, this is not the seed. The seed are actually inside this capsule, and this capsule can lay in the soil and absorb moisture and hold moisture for this seed to have a long time, days, to absorb some of that moisture and sprout. So it kind of has an advantage over other seeds that are laying out there bare naked like this guy here, because it has this protective capsule that's soaking up and holding moisture, which gives it an advantage to come up, especially if your soils are drying out. Another thing about Grassbur is that Grassbur wants to be a perennial plant, like we talked about earlier. Now, it's not going to produce that robust root system, but if this crown area stays alive because you didn't get enough freezing temperatures on it, this plant can live for one year to the next. It doesn't necessarily shut things down at the end of the year like most of our other annual plants. So just a couple little tidbits about Grassbur. Now, how do we control Grassbur? Several years ago, we got Prowl H2O cleared for Grassbur control. This is a little bit different methodology than we may be used to relative to pastures, where we're looking at a pre-emergence application prior to the emergence on dormant, established Bermuda grass hay fields and other weeds listed on the Prowl label, which are other grasses and some small seeded broadleaves. With that, we have to understand that our application rates are going to vary between 1 and 4.2 quarts per acre. Experience has taught me that it's better to go in with 2 quarts minimum for the most part. Apply with a properly calibrated broadcast boom sprayer. And now we're not talking about a cluster jet or a turkey tail or a single orifice sprayer here. We're talking about a flat fan sprayer on a long boom that you're probably not going to have if you're used to spraying in between trees and things like that. So, you may or may not have the equipment to do this. Applying in 10 gallons per acre of spray volume or 20 gallons of liquid fertilizer. It does need an inch of precipitation to activate the herbicide prior to the emergence of the sandbur or the grassbur. Okay, now with that said, when is this going to happen? Well, it depends from year to year. When that soil temperature gets 55 degrees at 4 inches deep, like I was talking about earlier, then you need to have had your herbicide out by that time. If you see farmers, planting crops in their fields in the springtime, you're probably too late. So in most of Texas, if you get this out in January or even February in parts of it, you're going to be plenty early enough. This may be a little fly in the ointment here. 45-day grazing restriction, 60-day hay harvest restriction. So you got to keep the cattle off there for a while. Relative to rates, these are rates. These are research rates in terms of pounds of active ingredient, but for the most part, they relate very closely to quarts per acre. And I said that probably the best for you to use a minimum of 2 quarts per acre to get any kind of decent weed control on out into the season. Or you can follow up an early application with a post-emergence application of the next herbicide I'm going to talk about, that being Pastora. Pastora is a different deal here. It's one that is applied after the weeds have come up. All right. It has 2 active ingredients in it, nicosulfuron and metsulfuron methyl, which you're probably familiar with, again, as the herbicide that's in Cimarron or Ally. Use rates are very low, again. This is one thing we've got to understand in terms of our application accuracy. We've tested the product time and years, long before it came out. It's a very effective herbicide on dense infestations of Grassbur. Now, with all that said, we have to understand that, again, there's a little bit of baggage in here, and that it's a post-emergence or foliar application of 1 to 1.5 ounces per acre to Grassbur seedlings less than 1.5 inches tall or across. So what this tells you is you have to be looking for the Grassbur and you have to jump on it. Now, Grassbur is not going to be growing real fast when it first comes up, but again, you're not going to have much time from the time you see it at 1.5 inches till the time you need to get out there and get after it with an application of the Pastora. In terms of additional application parameters, you can go in with spot applications. Look at 2.5 ounces of Pastora in 100 gallons of water. Again, both of these with a surfactant. Some additional things here. Not only does Pastora control Grassbur, but it also has activity on a lot of other annual grasses, as well as perennial Johnsongrass and Vaseygrass at the high rate in a lot of different broadleaf species. So it brings a lot to the table, but the timeliness could be an issue for you. Again, broadcast application booms with flat fan or flood jet nozzles, not the boom jet types of nozzles here. And again, always include a non-ionic surfactant or crop oil concentrate. And one thing that might be appealing to you is there are no grazing or haying restrictions here. So again, I think this is something that is very useful to us, but the application parameters have to be adhered to. So, does it work? Yes, it works great. If you put it on when those weeds are small, you're going to get outstanding control from this product. But again, you have to get them on time. So where are we in all this? These new herbicide programs are certainly showing good to excellent control, much better than anything we've had in the past, with no harm to Bermuda grass. But this is the deal here. We've got to be very diligent in our scouting and treatment timeliness. We're not going to be able to control Grassbur when it's in the seed head stage, and this illustrates this. If you want to control the seedlings before they come up, Prowl H2O. If you want to wait till they come up or see what you got out there, you have to get them before they're 1.5 inches tall with the Pastora. You may stop a Grassbur plant this large from producing the burr over here, but that's really iffy. We've seen it, happen a lot, but by the same token, we've seen no results whatsoever as well. They get this large here, forget it. With both herbicides, you're basically just going to have to wait till next year. Johnsongrass. And Cheryl and Ted, I'll answer your questions at the end here if you don't mind. Let's talk about Johnsongrass as a perennial plant. Again, it's going to have not only the top growth but extensive root system underneath it here. For control, we got some excellent products. Outrider from Monsanto, which will give you control of Johnsongrass up to 18 inches tall, 18 inches tall to heading. And in fact, you should actually wait till it gets 18 inches before you treat it to get the best control. With all that said, don't rely on it for control of grassbur. Excellent Bermuda grass tolerance, no problem there. Now the Pastora I just talked about also has a label for Johnsongrass up to 18 inches tall here at an ounce per acre. Now I'll make a point here in that it doesn't seem to make a lot of sense where we can get Johnsongrass, a perennial grass, up to 18 inches tall, but we have to get grassbur when it's less than 1.5 inches. Well, get used to that, folks, because this new chemistry is really dicey in terms of what you can't make any false assumptions about what it's going to do on one weed versus the other. So you really got to sit down and read the label. KR Bluestem suppression, Pastora has a label for it from 1 to 1.5 ounces per acre. You're going to have to use repeat applications, as I'll show you here in a second, to get any kind of suppression. And understand that suppression is not elimination or control, and it's defined on the label as a reduction in weed competition, is visually compared to an untreated area. The degree of suppression varies with the size of the weeds and the environmental conditions during and after treatment. What's this saying to us? It's saying that you may get 20% control and you may get 80%. It's up in the air. This is an example of a study we did in 2011. This was, as you remember, was a very dry year, so we didn't have a whole lot of Bermuda grass response. This is 3/4 of an ounce. This is 2 applications. 3/4 an ounce followed by 3/4 of an ounce. And all the tall stuff in here is KR Bluestem. This is another picture here of, of Pastora at 1 ounce, and then Pastora at 1 ounce followed by 1 ounce. And this is, you're really seeing a substantial reduction in growth and vigor of the KR Bluestem. Had we had a normal year, we would have had a lot of Bermuda grass recovery and growth in these plots. There's no question about it. So again, 2 applications, the higher rate, or 1 ounce per acre, is going to give you the best results, especially when you compare this treatment versus an untreated area. So if you really want to get rid of your KR Bluestem, there are some possibilities out there. Vaseygrass is an issue for you. If you're in East Texas and you want to get rid of Vaseygrass, this is another thing that we kind of found out just doing this research. We're looking at Pastora at normal application rates at one timing, and we're getting very little results on Vaseygrass even into the following year, 256 days after treatment. But so what we decided to do was to go ahead and follow up one application with another, and this made all the difference in the world relative to control. So if Vaseygrass is an issue for you in the pasture, 1 ounce followed by another ounce about 3 weeks after that makes all the difference in the world in terms of effectiveness, even the following year. So, if that's an issue for you, keep that in mind. Just real quickly on Huisache, we don't do a lot of brush work, but this is one study that we had, and the point I guess I'll make here is that, in this particular study, these are our control ratings a year after application. I should probably have the 2-year evaluations up here, but the point I want to make here is, if you want to get 100% kill, you can get that, but you're going to have to spend a lot of money. Is your money better off spent, satisfying yourself with lesser control here and spending lesser amounts of dollars in here? That's just a question you have to answer yourself. Just real quickly, there's a new experimental herbicide that's hopefully coming out soon. It's been under research and been held up for years by the EPA, called aminocyclopyrachlor. You may be familiar with it. It's known as MAT28. Controls a wide range of broadleaf weeds and brush. It's likely to be labeled in combination with another herbicide to fit the area for the weed or brush species. And one of these products, and for the most part, Perspective is already on the market as a roadside herbicide. For us, we'll probably look at either Invora or Rejuvra. And again, these were DuPont names before they sold this chemistry to Bayer, so there might, there might be some differences, but they're probably going to buddy aminocyclopyrachlor up with triclopyr, which is Remedy, or just a little dab of Remedy in this mixture for areas where you're trying to treat and control weeds and brush in Bahia grass pastures or areas where you want to keep the Bahia grass. The Rejuvra would be a mixture of aminocyclopyrachlor plus metsulfuron methyl, which is again the ally or the Cimarron. So if you want to take care of your weeds and brush as well as eliminate your Bermuda grass, that would be a product of choice. All depends on what you want to keep out there. Yeah, we're finding some interesting results with this product. This is something that's probably not etched in stone right now, but I think my range counterparts have been seeing a lot of the same thing, where we've come in and mowed the plots 60 to 70 days after we've applied the herbicide. We're seeing equivalent and sometimes even better control on Huisache. And this again flies in the face of a lot of what we've learned, over the years. But this is a different chemistry, folks, and we're seeing some different stuff. Overall, very effective on Huisache. Silverleaf Nightshade, again, reasonably effective on it. It's death on camphor weed if that happens to be an issue for you. Same with marsh elder. I talked about marsh elder earlier. The Rejuvra product and other aminocyclopyr products are highly effective on marsh elder. This is an example of one of our field studies there. Bitter sneezeweed, again, no challenge to it. A little bit about a couple points I'd like to make here about using Rejuvra versus other broadleaf herbicides such as Graze On Next. What the Rejuvra is going to do is, as I mentioned earlier, is not only take care of the broadleaf weeds in the pasture, but also take care of the Bahia grass without hurting the Tifton 85 or other Bermuda grass species in there. So a little bit on greenbrier. I think everybody that's out there in the audience has probably dealt with this at one time or another. Keep in mind what you're looking at here, folks. You're trying to get enough herbicide on a stringy old plant with a long green vine and a few leaves to get enough herbicide on that to kill out this nasty, knotty looking tuber at the base of the plant. And if you've never seen this tuber, you hadn't been diligent enough in your greenbrier eradication efforts. So, take a look at that next time, and this is what you have to kill out, of course, or have some degree of effectiveness on it. I had a grad student that took greenbrier on as one of his projects, and essentially, in terms of control, you're looking at remedy, okay, for the most part. Either applied, by itself, and this is the blue bars, what you want to take a look at here. This is the year following application. Remedy by itself with a 5% diesel and an emulsifier, or with, our brush application rate or treatment here that's often recommended from 75% remedy, 25% remedy, 75% diesel. Again, you're going to have some effect on your grasses there. But if greenbrier becomes a big issue for you, you can get some good results with that treatment. Newly sprigged hay fields, I said I'd touch on this, and this is getting towards the end of my talk here, so please bear with me. The first thing you got to do is get rid of the old stuff out there, okay? Especially if there are perennial weeds. You'll need to kill, whether it's Johnsongrass or whether it's something else, you'll need to get rid of them. Sprig good material, get it covered and compacted so that you have good soil root contact out there. Be aware that your land preparation will encourage new weed infestations, in that when you go in there and start tilling, you're going to bring weed seed up to the surface to where they're going to germinate and come on and compete with your forage grass in there. So, with that said, I'm sorry, I've got my phone's ringing here. I keep hanging up, but they're not getting the message. Use a pre-emergent herbicide. If you're going to spend all the money you're going to have to spend to establish a new stand of grass, for God's sake, spend a little more to get weed control. There are a couple of herbicides that are labeled for this. The herbicides Diuron and the herbicide Weedmaster, or their equivalents out there. From 1 to 2 quarts per acre. Do they work? This is a study we did several years ago. If you look at, this is a field we had sprigged with Tifton 85. This is an untreated area showing the weed infestation out there competing with the grass. This is 1 quart per acre of Weedmaster. This is 2 quarts per acre of Weedmaster. Diuron works even a little better. 2 quarts per acre here, for example, 1 quart per acre in here. So again, if you're going to spend all that money to establish this stand, make sure you take care of the weeds that are certainly going to come. I'll end this part of it anyway as telling you that like I mentioned earlier, the best weed management program is a good forage stand. Okay, fertilize according to soil test recommendations. Folks, I can't emphasize this enough. Go out there and spend $25 on a soil test. It's going to tell you what's there, what you need, and what you don't need, because you may have enough there to where you can cut back some years versus another, what have you. Take care of your weed problems early, especially if they're annual weeds like we discussed earlier for the reasons we discussed. Get them out of there. Don't let them pick your pocket. Control your stock density and grazing as much as you can. Granted, there's a time when you can sell cows, and there's a time when you can't. Of course, so we got to keep that in mind at all if it's at all possible. Leave standing stubble for faster regrowth. If you graze it down to the nub or to the ground, that root system is going to stop. Okay, and if you don't have a good, well-growing root system, then you're not going to have any top growth. So leave a little bit of standing stubble. With that, I'm going to address a couple questions in here. Let's see. Cheryl, you're asking the question, for weedy turf, is there a wait period after sodding a home site for Pastora? First of all, Cheryl, Pastora does not have a turf grass label. Okay, so you can't use Pastora in turf. If you're sodding and you have weeds in there are a bunch of different herbicides out for both pre-emergence and post-emergence weed control. And if you refer to my website there, or you can email me, I'll be glad to make those recommendations for you. Ted, you're asking for the Edwards Plateau. I've heard February was the month to treat for grassburs. I'd say yes. Make sure you get it done by the end of February. It wouldn't hurt you to get the treatments out in January, because the herbicide is going to be stable enough to last for a while. Okay, let's see. Kay, you're asking about when do you spray greenbrier? There's a couple different thoughts on this, Kay, in that we're looking at, we used to go by the recommendation to make a dormant stem treatment of dicamba herbicide. I'm not so sure that's such a good idea because you don't have any leaves on the greenbrier and what have you. I would wait until it gets fully leafed out before those leaves get too hardened off. In other words, don't wait till August to spray it. When the leaves are fully flushed out, in June, for example, that would be the time when I would recommend it. McCartney Rose, Carolyn, you got a question about McCartney Rose. Unfortunately, that remains one of our toughest brush species to control, and it's largely due to the fact that, and again, you refer to these are mostly small plants, not established bushes. But again, Carolyn, I would ask the question, are you sure those plants haven't been shredded off for 20 years out there? They may be fairly small, but they may have 20 years worth of root growth underneath them. A gallon per acre of Grazon PD is one of the standard recommendations. I would refer you to the range beef 14.7, whatever that is. I'm sorry, one of you guys is going to have to help me here about there's the range people have a yeah. Thanks, Megan. Okay, it's the publication number is ERM 1466. Kara, I appreciate that. But there are some further recommendations for McCartney Rose in that publication. So I'd refer you to that, Carolyn.
I think let me go ahead and say this right quick.
Okay.
The survey is going to kick out here on your browser. Please fill out the survey. It really help us, with the webinars. Again, if by some chance the survey locks up to your Adobe Connect, just click on Adobe Connect down the bottom, and it'll come back up. Again, our in February, our upcoming events in February, plant identification tips, Dr. Baron Rector. You can also follow us on Facebook, facebook.com/txrange. And Dr. Baumann, thank you for being here today, and I'm gonna go ahead and kick this thing back up to your email and site and see if you have any more questions.
Okay. So Pete, are we done here, Pete? Or
yes, sir.
Okay.
We're done.
Okay.
Get some questions. Get some folks ask some questions. I'm gonna go ahead and put the survey link down here in case some folks didn't get it. They can click on that and they'll get the survey.
All right. Are you going to take me back to the text box where they might have typed in questions, Pete?
Yes, sir. I'm kind of scrolling through there right now.
Oh, okay. Good enough.
Trying to see if I've missed any questions. Ted asked, with Edwards Plateau, I heard February was the month to treat Grassbur.
Yeah, and I indicated that would be plenty good for that area, but it wouldn't hurt to get the application out in January. You're not going to lose a measurable amount of product by getting it out early. And by product, we're talking about the Prowl H2O.
I don't see any other questions coming in so far.